everyone, welcome. Today I'm here to talk about colonialism, you and your students. First, I'd like to acknowledge that this is the land of the Islander people and pay my respects to any Indigenous people here with us today. So today I'm here to talk to you about European colonialism, its impacts and ongoing nature. I'm here to discuss the importance of teachers understanding colonialism and what this understanding means for our pedagogy. And I'll also be discussing the importance of including meaningful Indigenous content into our teaching. I'd just like to quickly draw attention to this image of Adam Goods, which I think really does demonstrate the ongoing nature of colonialism and is very much a reaction to the systemic race in society. So European colonialism, what happened? As McNaughton and Davis illustrates, colonialism is the economic and cultural oppression and exploitation, a system of control that occurred as a result of European expansion. Larkin illustrates that the settler-colonial dynamic is one of domination, where political and economic power has been structured to continue the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. As Hampton and Toombs assert, the colonial process was rooted in dispossession of lands, which resulted in Indigenous people's isolation from their spiritual life and from their economic base. So colonialism also manifests itself in colonial policies. As Shannon asserts, policies such as protection and assimilation were introduced as a system of powerful control over Indigenous peoples. From the perspective of policymakers, it was thought that Aboriginal people were a dying race, and these policies were introduced in order to smooth the dying pillow, which, as it was termed at the time. I'd just like to bring your attention to this reference to Kate Grenville's The Secret River, which really does demonstrate the violence and injustice of non-Indigenous relations. Alright, so what are the impacts of colonialism? This work by Richard Bell alludes to the negative experiences and lived reality wrought by colonialism, such as racism, and I think it's really a powerful piece. As Ty McKay and Maple illustrate, colonialism has taken and continues to take its toll on the health and well-being of Indigenous Australians. Hampton and Toombs assert that colonial dominance has caused the disempowerment and dispossession from land, resulting in severe implications for self-esteem and well-being amongst Indigenous peoples. Parker illustrates that colonial practices have led to psychological distress, spiritual despair, marginalisation and poverty, and as Ty McKay and Maple illustrate, to intergenerational trauma and continuing cycles of violence and loss. Additionally, Milroy has coined the term malignant grief in order to describe the process of collective, cumulative and irresolvable grief that affects some Indigenous people. Shizweki illustrates that continued racism from colonialism, which continues to bar Indigenous participation from society. Atkinson also alludes to the continuing trauma as a result of disease, violence, starvation and death, as trauma is shared by individuals and the collective, and today trauma is very much in the hearts, minds and souls of some Indigenous people. According to Atkinson, colonial practices have meant Indigenous people experience changed mindsets as they felt fear, anger, anxiety and depression. Alcohol drinking became a coping mechanism for some Indigenous people, leading to further traumatisation through the resulting violence. As McCann and Strakosch illustrate, colonialism is an ongoing reality for Indigenous people, manifesting itself in colonial structures such as racism and discrimination. So, why is it important for our teachers to understand colonialism? It is important for us because we need to prepare students for life in society, to discontinue colonialism and to ensure that we are properly prepared to teach Indigenous students. We need to recognise our influence as teachers on the minds of students and conversely society. I'd just like to draw your attention to this artwork by Vernon Arkey, which really is a talking point and alludes to the silent agony of living under systemic discrimination. And I think also we can use as a point for discussing our role in stopping colonialism in its tracks. As Madison asserts, through an understanding of colonialism and recognition of past injuries, it enables us to rewrite aspects of the history and to reshape our present. As Rose asserts, as educators, it is incredibly damaging if through our teaching we further colonial discourses and support the ignorance of Indigenous issues. This ignorance then replicates itself into a vicious cycle and the continuation of silent apartheid. According to Vass, it is this uncritical production and reproduction of knowledge that sustains colonialism. As Madison asserts, we need to prepare our students to be adequate citizens and well-informed voters. Many non-Indigenous Australians feel silenced by their lack of knowledge on Indigenous issues, and as teachers, we need to adequately prepare students for serious engagement with Indigenous issues. As Lau and Porter and Craven assert, a limited education on Indigenous issues and perspectives limits the opportunities for students to challenge and overcome racism in society. Madison illustrates that an understanding of colonialism is important for the path towards reconciliation, as through education about our true history, the divide and the violence, reconciliation can be achieved. An understanding of colonialism is also important for supporting Indigenous students in our classes. As Stewart asserts, by continuing to trivialise Indigenous knowledge and furthering mistruths and stereotypes, we marginalise Indigenous students and limit their educational success. It is also important, as she asserts, that this understanding of colonialism, through this, that we recognise our own cultural bias within ourselves, our classrooms, and in our curriculum. As Chisholm asserts, a lack of awareness or sensitivity of this cultural bias can perpetuate stereotypes and diminish Indigenous student educational success. How does this impact our pedagogy? Well, importantly, we need to move away from teaching which trivialises Indigenous perspectives and give students authentic information about Australia's history, teach them to think critically about information and embed Indigenous perspectives into our teaching. I would argue that our understanding of colonialism demands that we teach critical thinking skills to students. As Munro et al. Assert, this is due to the ongoing nature of colonialism and the need to deconstruct and question colonial discourses and mistruths. We need to meaningfully embed Indigenous perspectives into learning. As Kanu illustrates, the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives supports students to develop respect and understanding for Indigenous cultures, histories, and contemporary lifestyles, and also allows students to critically examine history, discrimination, and their position in society. As McLaughlin and Watman assert, there does exist a perception that Indigenous knowledge is irrelevant to Australian society. However, it can actually enhance educational success. As Ray asserts, studying Indigenous content has benefits for students due to the authenticity of learning experiences. And Ray illustrates that allowing for meaningful exchanges of life histories and experiences, and also allows for the exploration into Indigenous history and contemporary issues. As Nakata illustrates, we need to embed Indigenous perspectives across all our subjects, from maths to history to English. An example of Indigenous knowledge inclusion might be the use of Indigenous resources when discussing caring for the environment in HAS, or including resources on Mangrok when teaching at PE unit. As Nakata asserts, by including Indigenous knowledge, we insert into students' thinking a different way of understanding contemporary Indigenous presence. As Nakata asserts, teachers need to be thinking about when it is critical to embed Indigenous perspectives. An example of this may be the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives when examining Anzac Day or when examining the stolen generations and its impact on individuals and society. Okay, I'd just like to respond to this quote. So, if we limit Indigenous education to dance, dot paintings and annual events, we further the colonial view of Indigenous peoples, and the racism persists, and as misconceptions and mistruths about Indigenous people are furthered. I'd just like to draw your attention to this artwork by Christopher Pease, which challenges Europeans' depiction of Aboriginal people. As Morrison asserts, such understandings trivialise Indigenous cultures whilst furthering the understanding that Aboriginal people are limited to the man on the $2 coin. As Rose illustrates, this works to replicate ignorance and which continues in a vicious cycle. These sorts of activities create understandings of children of Aboriginal people belonging to the past, practising exotic and primitive lifestyles, and the othering of Indigenous people, according to McNaughton and Davis. This includes the idea that Indigenous Australians can be homogenised into a collective they, which is distinct from the cultural mainstream. Additionally, as McNaughton and Davis assert, this represents the process of othering as Aboriginal people are positioned as different from the mainstream, and the binary between us and them is continued. As Younger Porter illustrates, such acts highlight the difference between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems caused by misconceptions about Indigenous knowledge, and that there persists the idea that Aboriginality is only limited to cultural items and acts. As a result of the silent apartheid and the colonisation of the mind, Indigenous cultures, worldviews and histories are dismissed as irrelevant and unimportant. According to Craven, this lack of meaningful knowledge in which misconceptions and stereotypes are generated mean that Australians have not been able to overcome and challenge racism in society. So to summarise, in this presentation I have discussed the damaging and ongoing nature of European colonialism and its impact this practice has on Indigenous Australians. I have stressed the importance for teachers to understand the event, as we need to, as teachers, we can further or challenge discourses of colonialism. I've also stressed the importance of including meaningful Indigenous perspectives into content, and I've also stressed the need to move away from tokenistic appreciation derived from superficial content. I'd like to conclude by echoing Rose's sentiment, who asserts that as teachers we are privileged with a great opportunity to make a difference in the lives of students. We can contribute to a better society by deconstructing colonial discourses and challenge our students with Indigenous perspectives and content. Thank you for your time.